After his wife's funeral, the husband, along with his mistress, went to the notary to settle the matter of his wife's inheritance. As they arrived, Jack, the husband, reflected on the events that had led them there. Jack had married Rachel 3 years ago, though it wasn't love that drove him to the altar. Rachel had become the sole heir to her father's prosperous business after his sudden death from a stroke, and Jack, a man with a charming smile but a lazy spirit, saw her as his golden ticket to a life of luxury. Rachel, the only child of Mr. Monroe, was now the owner of a vast fortune, making her a prime target for Jack, who had always relied on wealthy women to sustain his comfortable lifestyle. Rachel, deeply grieving her father, was drawn in by Jack's sweet words and promises, never suspecting that he saw her as a mere stepping stone to greater wealth. In the early days of their relationship, Jack was careful to play the part of a loving partner, knowing that Rachel's affection was his key to controlling her newly inherited riches. He was there for her during the most vulnerable time in her life, providing the comfort she desperately needed. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Jack's true nature was hidden behind a facade, a mask he intended to keep in place until their marriage was secure. Once they were married, Jack believed he could easily manipulate Rachel into handing over control of her fortune. But he underestimated the influence of Mr. Langford, Rachel's godfather and her father's most trusted friend. Mr. Langford, who had watched Rachel grow up, saw through Jack's intentions. Sensing the danger Jack posed, he persuaded Rachel to insist on a prenuptial agreement that would protect her assets. Jack, taken aback by this unexpected hurdle, tried to object, claiming it was a matter of trust. But Rachel, guided by her godfather's wisdom, was firm. She assured Jack it was just a formality, a safeguard in case things ever went wrong. Reluctantly, Jack agreed, but the prenuptial agreement was ironclad, leaving him with no legal claim to Rachel's business or her inherited properties. Despite the setback, Jack wasn't disheartened. He believed he could still gain access to Rachel's wealth through the marriage itself, siphoning money slowly but surely. However, he quickly discovered that Mr. Langford had anticipated his every move. The business and Rachel's finances were carefully monitored, leaving Jack with little more than a modest allowance. Still, Jack remained patient, confident that time would eventually tip the scales in his favor. But life had other plans. Rachel, eager to start a family, was devastated when, after months of trying, she failed to conceive. As the stress of her business and the pressure of her unfulfilled dream took their toll, Rachel began to experience troubling symptoms. What she thought was exhaustion from her hectic life was actually the early warning signs of a serious illness. After undergoing medical tests, Rachel was diagnosed with cancer, a diagnosis that shattered her world. For nearly 2 years, Rachel fought bravely against the disease, enduring painful treatments and countless disappointments. During this time, Jack's true colors began to show. He was a husband in name only, his mind already drifting to a future without Rachel. Though she never confronted him directly, Rachel was painfully aware of his infidelity and his growing impatience for her death. Jack, convinced of his own cleverness, believed he was still playing the perfect husband, waiting for the day he could finally claim the fortune he had married into. But as Rachel's health deteriorated, it became clear that Jack's dreams of wealth and freedom might not come to fruition as easily as he had hoped. Jack's actions became the subject of intense discussion, from the nurses who cared for Rachel in her final days, to Mr. Langford, who was both enraged and helpless. He couldn't fathom why Rachel clung to the idea of saving her marriage while on her deathbed. Adding to his distress, Rachel hadn't written a will, meaning that Jack, her husband, would automatically inherit everything. Mr. Langford lamented, convinced that Jack, a spendthrift by nature, would squander all that Rachel and her father had worked so hard to build. Yet, the old man was at a loss on how to approach such a sensitive topic with his goddaughter, who had seemed so full of life until now, as her time dwindled to mere weeks. Jack, meanwhile, was already salivating at the thought of Rachel's demise, eager to get his hands on the wealth he believed was as good as his. He saw her death as inevitable, and the inheritance as a foregone conclusion. But Mr. Langford, praying he wouldn't need to broach the subject himself, was relieved when Rachel took the lead. She disclosed a secret plan, so meticulously crafted and executed with such quiet resolve that it left him speechless. He never imagined Rachel would choose revenge, but she did so with a cold precision that was nothing short of masterful. Her plan required little effort but was perfectly timed, ensuring she fulfilled her deepest desires before passing away. Tragically, no miracle saved Rachel, and she died as planned, carefully orchestrating her final wishes down to the last detail. After the funeral, a notary summoned those mentioned in her will for its reading. Jack was stunned by this development, confident that Rachel hadn't prepared any official document, assuming he'd inherit everything by default. Still, he went to the meeting, bringing along his new lover Stacy, a striking beauty. As he entered the notary's office, he noticed Mr. Langford and Carl Tress, Rachel's friend. But what truly shocked him was the sight of Carl pushing a stroller with a young boy. Jack was completely unaware of Carl's marriage or that he had a child. Although not an expert, Jack wasn't foolish and quickly sensed that something was amiss, that he had been deceived. Yet curiosity kept him in the room, eager to discover Rachel's final play, even as he knew it would be at his expense. For about 15 minutes, the room was filled with an uneasy silence as everyone occupied different corners. The notary seemed to prolong the suspense, slowly explaining the purpose of their gathering and the honor of reading Rachel's last will. When Jack's name was finally mentioned, it was with a cruel smile that the notary declared, "To my lawful husband Jack, I deny the inheritance." The words struck like a blow, and the notary asked Jack if he understood their meaning. Humiliated, Jack could only nod as Stacy grabbed his hand, ready to leave in defiance. But Jack, ignoring her, stayed rooted to his spot, desperate to escape the public disgrace, but knowing the drama wasn't over. The notary resumed, "I leave all my personal belongings to my only son, Tommy Tress, until he reaches adulthood, with Carl Tress and Mr. Langford as his guardians and administrators of his estate." The revelation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. A son. Carl's son. Jack's shock turned to an outburst, unable to believe what he was hearing. Yet, the others weren't surprised. Mr. Langford confirmed, explaining that Tommy was Rachel's biological child with Carl, conceived before her illness robbed her of the chance to carry a pregnancy to term. Desperate, Jack argued, knowing full well that modern medicine made such a scenario possible. Mr. Langford, clearly relishing Jack's dismay, remarked on the marvels of today's medical technology. As Carl watched Jack's world crumble, he recalled the day Rachel, with calm determination, revealed her terminal diagnosis and her wish to become a mother, no matter what. "I preserved my eggs before treatment," she had told him. "They warned me I might never conceive, but I insisted. I grew up without a mother, Carl. It's not easy, but I always felt loved and protected by you." When Carl asked if Jack would raise the child, Rachel's response was bitter and dismissive. Who would trust him with that? He'd be happy to exploit the child's inheritance. "No, Carl, I know my husband's true nature. His reaction to my illness was proof enough. This man doesn't deserve my concern, but the baby, well, that's a different story." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Rachel began, her usual confidence wavering, something almost unheard of from her. She took a deep breath and finally blurted out, "I want you to be the father of my child." Her voice pitched higher than normal, clearly showing her nerves. Carl, stunned, could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Are you serious?" "You have a husband," he responded, trying to make sense of it all. Rachel nodded. "Yes, and I will, until the day I die." "That's settled. But we won't be intimate, of course. I can't carry the baby myself. I've kept my eggs, but now I need a father for my child, a man I can trust. And, of course, a woman to carry and give birth to the baby. Luckily, those services exist today." At first, Carl dismissed her idea as the desperate ramblings of someone in distress, but it quickly became clear Rachel had thought this through. She had already done extensive research, navigating legal hurdles, arranging for a surrogate, and even securing a reproductive clinic. "I could just use a donor, but this is different. I want someone who will truly care for the child," she continued, her voice softer now. "I trust you, Carl. I've known you for years, and I believe you'd be an incredible father. I know you have dreams of your own family, but please, just think about it. Don't answer right away." Rachel's gaze dropped as she mentioned her late husband Jack, who had taught her hard lessons about trust and money. "I need someone who isn't driven by greed, someone who won't exploit my wealth." "You're that person, Carl. You've built your success on hard work and integrity. I learned the hard way that those who grow up without enough will always be haunted by the fear of scarcity. and if they lack decency, it becomes a disaster. I lived through that. Carl was overwhelmed. I never imagined becoming a father like this. I need to talk to my parents. I can't make this decision alone, he confessed, realizing the weight of what she was asking. Rachel agreed, asking only for his discretion. When Carl finally broached the subject with his parents, the conversation was anything but easy. His father, ever pragmatic, listened without judgment and assured Carl of his support. His mother, on the other hand, struggled to accept it. She had always envisioned Carl marrying a good woman and raising a family in the traditional sense. Rachel had been a family friend for years, and his mother had always thought highly of her. But this was too much to digest. Rachel dying, another woman carrying her grandchild, and the question that gnawed at her. Could the child inherit Rachel's illness? Carl reassured his mother, explaining that Rachel's disease wasn't hereditary, which eased some of her fears, though not entirely. After much soul-searching, his mother reluctantly offered her support, realizing how important this was to her son. Carl himself wrestled with the decision, but after reflecting on Rachel's sincerity and the trust they shared, he eventually agreed. When he told Rachel, she was overjoyed, and together, they set their plan into motion. As Carl pondered the life-altering journey ahead, Mr. Langford found himself recalling a conversation he had with Rachel just 2 months prior. Rachel had approached him delicately, expressing how much she respected him, almost like a second father. She had then made a surprising request, asking him to become the guardian of her child. At first, Mr. Langford thought Rachel was being fanciful, but as she explained everything, he was stunned. Not only by the boldness of Rachel and Carl's decision, but also by how they had managed to keep it hidden for so long. "How old is the baby now?" he finally asked. "Tommy's 8 months," Rachel replied with a smile. Mr. Langford shook his head in disbelief. "You two really know how to keep a secret." "I can't let Jack find out about the child while I'm still alive. He'll only learn the truth when my will is read. The will is already prepared and safely with the notary. But there's still something I need to settle. Tommy will have only one father, and I've thought long and hard about this. I want everything to be perfectly clear. If anything happens to Kurt, Tommy will go to his parents, but I also want you to have some rights, just in case." The old man, wise in the ways of people, knew this could be risky, especially with someone like Jack, but he couldn't deny that Rachel's husband deserved it. "Rachel, are you really sure you want to do this to your husband?" he asked, concerned. "He's a vile man, but why this need for revenge from the grave?" Realizing he might have overstepped, he quickly apologized. "Forgive me, dear. I didn't mean to be harsh. I've been thinking about this for 2 years, ever since I witnessed Tommy's birth. I've seen how much Carl loves him, how much his parents adore him. I don't need anything else. I've come to terms with things as they are. What I can't stand is those who go on about miraculous recoveries. As for Jack, I loved him so deeply, believed in him so fully, and he betrayed me in the worst way. He visits the hospital like it's a chore. Did you know his girlfriends drop him off? And I'm supposed to forgive that? Never. Money is all he cares about, so that's how I'll get back at him. It'll be a shock to him, you'll see. I kept this secret even from you. It's been so hard. I wanted to introduce my son to you right away, but I was terrified someone would slip up and Jack would find out. This might be my final act against him. I even wrote a letter that the notary will deliver." Mr. Langford, trying to dissuade his goddaughter, felt this was a bad idea, but she was determined, and in the end, he had to give in. After all, this was her final wish, and it had to be respected. A heavy silence fell over the notary's office as everyone absorbed the gravity of the moment. It was obvious that Jack was cursing Rachel in his mind. People like him never see their own faults. They think everyone else's actions are just out of spite. Reflecting on their own behavior is simply beyond them. Strangely, it was Stacy who first broke the silence, trying to drag Jack out by the elbow. But Jack wasn't done. "Are you telling me I get nothing? Not even a mandatory share? I'm still her husband," he shouted, his tone so crude that even Stacy recoiled, and everyone else in the room was shocked. Only the notary remained unmoved, accustomed to such outbursts. He calmly replied, "You're not entitled to a mandatory share of the inheritance. And your marriage contract offers no loopholes. Here's the document." He patted the thick folder in front of him. "You stand no chance, even if you go to court, though that's your right. Contest it if you want, but know this, the child isn't illegitimate. Here are his birth certificate and medical records, all in order, and DNA tests confirm that Tommy is indeed your wife's biological son." Every detail was handled with the utmost care. "Can I see them?" Jack demanded, desperate to see the evidence. "No," the notary replied coolly. "You may only review the parts that pertain to you. All other documents, particularly those concerning the child, can only be disclosed with the parent's consent, of course." "I do not permit it," Carl interjected firmly. The only exception, he was told, would be through a court order if deemed necessary. That was the breaking point for Jack. He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him with a vow to pursue the matter further. His partner, though more composed, quietly said goodbye and gently closed the door. Mr. Langford then turned to the notary and inquired, "Does it matter that he didn't sign that the will was read to him?" The notary, unfazed, reassured him that it was just a formality. The situation was almost absurd, more tragic than amusing. "I still don't understand how Rachel ever got involved with him," Mr. Langford mused aloud, though he wasn't really expecting an answer. The men then quickly signed the remaining documents and shook hands. Mr. Langford helped Carl settle little Tommy into his stroller. "Would you like to join us?" Carl asked. "I'm planning to take a walk and get some fresh air. It's good for the baby." "Certainly, I'll walk with you for a while," Mr. Langford agreed. They walked in silence, the sound of the stroller's wheels the only thing breaking the quiet. Eventually, Carl voiced what had been weighing on his mind. "Do you think Rachel would be satisfied with how I'm handling things?" Mr. Langford offered his reassurance. "I'm sure she would be. You're a wonderful father, and it's clear how much you two meant to each other." Carl hesitated before continuing. "There's one thing that keeps bothering me. You know, I'm sure Rachel told you that I advised against what just happened at the notary's office. This whole mess with the will and how Jack found out about Tommy." Mr. Langford nodded in understanding. "I was the one who kept bringing it up," Carl admitted. "I never liked the idea from the start. Jack is a vile person, angry, ignorant, and greedy. Why provoke him? Honestly, I even thought about telling him once the baby was born that Rachel had been hiding so much, but I didn't think I had the right. I figured Rachel just didn't want to deal with him alone and left the disputes to us. But seeing him today, with that woman, without a shred of shame, I can't help but wonder if I made the right decision by not standing my ground." His reaction, the look on his face, it was horrible. Maybe we should have dealt with him sooner. But I think Rachel didn't want that either. Her desire for revenge played a role too. She loved deeply, despite what she said afterward, and that love, twisted by betrayal, found no other outlet. My poor girl. The elderly man wiped away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. "Don't worry about her. She asked us not to. She wanted us to direct all the love we had for her to Robbie," Carl said, trying to comfort Rachel's godfather. While the two men shared their memories, Jack sat in his car, fuming over the same topic. "So, you're not getting anything, right?" the girl asked him, her disbelief clear as she blinked rapidly. "You're an idiot. You heard them say you don't stand a chance now that the truth's out, didn't you? Let's go. We need to grab whatever we can and take it to my apartment." 3 days later, Carl finally mustered the courage to visit Rachel's house, bracing for a confrontation with Jack. He even hired 2 bodyguards for protection, but when he arrived, the house was empty. Jack had already struck gold, making off with as many valuables as he could carry. Now, Jack sat alone in the cramped kitchen of his tiny apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey Stacy had left behind, just as Carl had expected. After all, why would she stick around with a man who had lost everything? Jack found himself lost in contemplation, reflecting on how his life had taken such a drastic turn. There was a time when women paid for his company, but now the tables had turned. He had to offer money just to keep a pretty young woman by his side. It was a bitter irony for Jack, a former gigolo who had long since passed his prime, his once vibrant life now ravaged by his vices. Yet despite the obvious decline in his fortunes, he refused to acknowledge his own role in his downfall. In his mind, his late wife was the true villain, the one who had drained his vitality, shattered his dreams, and left him with nothing, not even the inheritance he had so eagerly awaited. In his fantasies, Jack was still young, handsome, wealthy, and wildly successful. But reality had a cruel way of shattering these illusions, and Stacy's harsh words cut through his delusions like a knife. She reminded him that no one needed him, that he was nothing more than a poor, washed-up drunkard clinging to fantasies of grandeur. Accepting this harsh truth was almost impossible for Jack. His dreams of wealth and success, which had largely hinged on his ex-wife, crumbled like a fragile house of cards. His ambitions to become a successful businessman were now nothing more than ashes. Blinded by his ego, Jack refused to see his part in his ruin, choosing instead to heap all the blame on his deceased wife. In his mind, he was a saint, a man who had never left his ailing wife's side, conveniently forgetting his numerous affairs, his alcohol-fueled escapades, and his contemptuous behavior toward her. "What a pity she's dead and I can't hit her," he mused bitterly more than once. He had often restrained himself with the thought that his patience would eventually be rewarded. Jack's bitterness drove him into a 2-week drinking binge, a futile attempt to escape his reality, with his resentment festering more each day. But one morning, hungover and feeling particularly low, Jack decided he had had enough. He realized that drowning himself in alcohol wouldn't bring him success, nor would it allow him to exact revenge on Rachel. His humiliation had reached its peak a few days earlier when Mr. Langford's men came to his door. They practically forced him to hand over the car keys, tearing up the power of attorney Rachel had left him. "Didn't you know a power of attorney loses its legal force after the person who issued it dies?" one of the men had sneered. Now, sober and stewing in his humiliation, Jack began plotting his revenge on Rachel. Desecrating her grave was his first thought, but soon he hit upon an idea that sent a jolt of excitement through him. He wouldn't just target her memory, he would strike at something much dearer to her. Tommy. The very thought of it made Jack's heart race with malicious glee. He laughed darkly as the plan began to form in his mind. Of course, there were many obstacles to overcome, but the main idea was clear. He wouldn't physically harm Tommy. No, he would do something far more insidious. He would kidnap the child and take him far away, leaving him in an orphanage. What could be more torturous for a mother than knowing her child was in distress and being unable to help? For a week, Jack reveled in these vengeful thoughts, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction, as if he had already won. He hadn't felt such happiness in a long time, though the expression that now twisted his face was anything but pleasant. It was menacing, even frightening, but Jack didn't care. He was too absorbed in the euphoria of imagining Rachel's suffering. With the plan set in his mind, Jack began to focus on the practical aspects. He needed to know everything about Tommy's daily routine, who took him out, where they went, and when. Jack's past familiarity with Carl and his family gave him a slight advantage, but he knew the elite suburban area was heavily guarded. The challenges were daunting, but Jack was determined. For days he hid in the woods, watching the house through binoculars, tracking the child's movements, and taking meticulous notes. He questioned himself. Was this effort worth it? Absolutely, he concluded with a malicious chuckle. Ever since the will had been read, Jack's mental state had deteriorated visibly. "She ruined my life, and I will ruin her son's," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. If someone had been near him at that moment, they might have seen the alarming changes in his behavior and urged him to seek help. But Jack was alone, and the story does not entertain what-ifs. Once Jack had a plan, no matter how deranged, he was committed to seeing it through. He spent every day preparing, scouting the area for the perfect vantage point to observe Carl's house while staying out of sight. For more than a week, he woke up at dawn and headed to the settlement, staying until late at night, always watching, always recording. Through his observations, Jack learned that Carl's mother and a nanny cared for Tommy. However, they posed a problem for Jack's plan. Both knew him well and could easily identify him. Still, Jack was undeterred. He would find a way to make his twisted fantasy a reality, no matter what it took. Jack was determined to avoid being caught or punished for the crime he was meticulously planning. Every detail of his scheme was carefully thought out, anticipating the inevitable questions from the police, but he was confident he could deflect their suspicions. His target was the nanny, a woman of routine, who always took the same paths with little Tommy. Fate seemed to be on Jack's side when one Wednesday, during her usual daytime stroll with the sleeping baby, the nanny left the safety of the settlement. She followed a secluded forest path to a clearing, where she often met another nanny from a neighboring settlement. Jack overheard their cheerful conversation and laughter, which assured him that his observations were accurate. To avoid arousing suspicion, Jack limited his visits to the settlement to Wednesdays, aligning with the nanny's walk. Every Wednesday, like clockwork, she left the secure confines and ventured into the forest. Jack spent 4 consecutive Wednesdays studying her routine, ensuring there were no unexpected changes. On the 4th Wednesday, he decided that the next week would be the time to strike. To execute his plan, Jack acquired a powerful taser from a local market, paying cash to leave no trace. He was thorough in his preparations, purchasing an old car, stealing license plates, and attaching them to the vehicle. He carefully chose a parking spot, close enough for a quick escape, yet far enough not to draw attention. He also took great care to disguise his appearance, altering his figure and face to avoid recognition. The thought of kidnapping consumed him entirely. It was the last thing he thought about before falling asleep, and the first thing that came to mind upon waking. The anxiety and obsession weighed heavily on him, causing him to lose nearly 7 kilograms in the process. He became a shadow of his former self, his appearance now marked by a neurosis that made him a figure of fear. On the fateful Wednesday, Jack parked in the pre-selected spot and waited. His hands trembled as he saw the nanny approach with the stroller. The reality of what he was about to do hit him hard. This was no longer just a meticulously crafted plan, but a confrontation with a real woman and a real child. The baby, unaware of the danger, curiously observed the surroundings. Jack, who was not naturally violent, struggled with the gravity of crossing this line. But his burning hatred for Rachel propelled him forward. He approached the nanny, forcefully pushing her away from the stroller, and knocked her to the ground. With the taser in hand, he shocked her into unconsciousness. All that remained was to take the child and flee. But at that crucial moment, things went terribly wrong. As Jack bent down to unfasten the belts holding the baby, he was suddenly struck on the head, collapsing to the ground. When he regained consciousness, an elderly man stood over him, berating him while tying his hands. Jack blacked out again. The old man turned out to be Mr. Turner, a well-known forest ranger who lived in a secluded house hidden among the dense vegetation between 2 elite settlements. Mr. Turner had been returning from the local store when he noticed the suspicious figure, dressed in black despite the morning heat. His years of experience in the forest allowed him to move silently and observe the unfolding scene. When he saw Jack attack the nanny, he initially thought it was a robbery. But as soon as he realized Jack was after the child, he didn't hesitate to act. Grabbing a stick, he struck Jack down before he could complete his heinous act. "Well done, Mr. Turner," said one of the police officers later. "You're a hero. The press is already gathering outside, eager to interview you. Just sign this report and you can enjoy your newfound fame." But Mr. Turner, uninterested in the limelight, calmly declined. "I'm not interested in that sort of thing," he said, quietly slipping away to his home by a roundabout route to avoid the attention. In his mind, he had done nothing extraordinary, just what anyone should do when those unable to defend themselves were in danger. Hours later, there was a knock on Mr. Turner's door. It was Carl, there to offer his thanks and gratitude. "I'm the father of the boy you saved today," Carl began, his voice trembling with emotion. "He's such a good kid, and the moment I held him, he calmed right down. He's brave and smart. Thank you so much. It's a miracle you were there when you were. We're so grateful you didn't just walk by." Tears welled up in Carl's eyes, the intensity of the day leaving him shaken to the core. "Please, tell me how I can thank you." Mr. Turner, clearly taken aback, replied, "There's no need to thank me." But Carl wouldn't let it go. After some persistence, Mr. Turner finally said, "Well, if you insist, maybe a new hunting outfit and some food for my dog would be nice." Carl eagerly agreed. "By the way," Mr. Turner added curiously, "was all this for money?" Carl sighed deeply. "Unfortunately, it's far more complicated than that." Encouraged by Mr. Turner's curiosity, Carl began to unravel the tangled web of the last few years. Rachel's illness, the difficult decision about paternity, her eventual death, and the spiral of revenge that followed. He recounted how the investigator revealed that Jack was deeply hurt, feeling as though everyone believed his actions were purely driven by greed. Jack was consumed by revenge, Carl explained, a burden lifting as he shared his story. He had longed for someone to offer an impartial perspective, to help him understand whether they had pushed Jack to the brink of madness and vengeance. "If it were just me, I could bear it," Carl said, his voice cracking. "But everything Rachel and I did seems to have come back to haunt our son." Turning to Mr. Turner, Carl asked, "Do you think we're to blame for Jack's desire for revenge?" Mr. Turner, never one to mince words, replied bluntly, "Are you serious? You're an adult, and you're saying this? That Jack of yours always found an excuse, didn't even need one. He married for money, cheated openly, mistreated his sick wife, and somehow convinced himself it was all her fault. Her fault for fighting back, for losing patience, for not enduring. She hit him where it hurt most, his wallet. No, on the contrary, well done to her. She planned and she executed. That woman had every right." Mr. Turner's candid response hit Carl like a splash of cold water, but it lifted his spirits. He reflected deeply on Mr. Turner's words. "Now I owe you for the good advice," Carl said with a small smile. The two men parted as friends, with Mr. Turner promising to check in on the boy. "I've heard it said," the ranger remarked as he was leaving, "that if you save someone's life, you're responsible for that person forever. So don't worry about your Tommy. I'll be looking after him too." True to his word, Mr. Turner became a regular visitor at Carl's house, always welcomed with open arms. In time, he became another loving family member to the boy. Meanwhile, the court sentenced Jack to several years in prison. With his departure, the household gradually returned to peace. Carl's life began to blossom again. He met a single mother whose daughter attended the same kindergarten as Tommy, and their children bonded quickly. Carl's parents dared to hope that this time their son would find happiness, and that Tommy might gain a loving stepmother and perhaps even a sibling. Yet Carl never forgot the promise he made to Rachel. He often spoke to Tommy about his mother, showing him pictures and videos, ensuring the boy knew how much she had loved him and how she was still watching over him, even if he couldn't see her. As I wrap up this story, I hope it touched your heart. Stay tuned for more, and if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. See you soon, and take care until then.